There comes a moment when you begin to sense that not every battle in your life is physical or emotional. Some are deeply spiritual. You start noticing patterns that repeat through generations, conflicts that don't make sense, tension that rises in the atmosphere without reason, and behaviors in people you love that drain your spirit more than your emotions. You look at your circle and realize not every smile is rooted in love, not every connection is divine, and not every family tie carries the blessing of God. Sometimes spiritual warfare hides behind laughter. Sometimes it moves through familiar voices, and sometimes it stands in the room disguised as support. This is where discernment becomes a weapon, where spiritual awareness becomes your shield, when your spirit starts feeling heavy around certain people, when conversations leave you spiritually exhausted, when peace feels like it's being choked in your presence. That's not just mood. That's warfare. And until you learn to identify the spirit behind the person, you'll keep fighting the wrong enemy and wondering why you keep losing battles that look small on the outside but feel massive in your spirit. There is a unique kind of battle that happens when the warfare you're facing doesn't come from strangers, but from people you know, love, and trust. The enemy is strategic and subtle, and he understands that the greatest access to your heart is through those you keep close. When spiritual warfare disguises itself through familiar faces, it becomes harder to recognize because love creates a kind of blindness. You tell yourself they didn't mean it that way, that maybe you're being too sensitive, too spiritual, too dramatic, but deep inside your spirit is unsettled. Something within you feels a disturbance, a shift in energy, a drain that doesn't match the surface conversation. They smile while speaking, but their words pierce. They call it a joke, but it stings your soul. They say they care, but their presence feels like a weight pressing on your chest. That's how spiritual warfare hides. It doesn't always come screaming with clear signs. Sometimes it walks in wearing the face of someone you have prayed for, defended, and protected. When you start to feel your spirit shift in the presence of certain people, that's your first sign. Your body may not understand it. Your mind might try to justify it, but your spirit knows something is not aligned. Discernment is not suspicion. It's a spiritual awareness given by God to help you identify the unseen motives and influences operating through people. The enemy doesn't need to possess someone fully to use them. All he needs is agreement, a moment of jealousy, a root of bitterness, a silent envy, an unspoken offense. These are open doors. And when those doors are left unguarded, the enemy walks in and begins to speak through familiar voices. That's why the tone feels off, even when the words sound fine. That's why the atmosphere feels heavy, even when nothing wrong was said. Spirits communicate beyond language. You don't just hear them, you feel them. You start noticing that every time you share good news, they respond with sarcasm or subtle shade. You speak about your dreams, and their reaction leaves you feeling small. They ask for details about your life, not to support you, but to monitor your progress. They show up when there's drama, but disappear when it's time to build. They applaud your pain, but stay silent in your breakthrough, and you try to love them through it, but love was never meant to be blind. It was meant to be wise. Discernment doesn't make you hard, it makes you guarded. Guarded not in bitterness, but in wisdom. Guarded not in anger, but in awareness. Because the real enemy isn't the person, it's the spirit operating behind the behavior. When you start recognizing the pattern, you'll see that the conversations are designed to pull you back into who you used to be. They remind you of your past, not to celebrate how far you've come, but to anchor you in shame. They bring up your mistakes, not to show growth, but to minimize your progress. They talk in circles that lead nowhere but exhaustion. And when you try to pull away, guilt rises. The enemy uses guilt as a leash to keep you connected to what is draining you. He whispers that distancing yourself is unloving, that creating space is selfish, that protecting your peace is disrespectful. But there is a difference between dishonor and discernment. Honor does not mean access. You can love someone and still limit their influence in your life. You can pray for them and still refuse to participate in their emotional chaos. You can forgive them and still recognize the spirit that keeps showing up through their words and actions. The warfare becomes more intense when you finally decide to choose your spiritual health over familiar comfort. People will call you distant, changed, difficult, but they won't mention how your spirit used to be under attack every time you tried to stay connected. They won't mention how your peace used to vanish after every visit, how your confidence used to shrink after every conversation, how your joy used to feel unstable after every interaction. They won't mention how many silent battles you fought just to keep smiling in the presence of people who secretly celebrated your struggles. But your spirit remembers. Your spirit records every moment where your peace was under siege. And eventually, God begins to show you that protecting your spirit is not rebellion, it's obedience. Because you cannot fight spiritual battles while holding hands with what is attacking you in the spirit. You cannot pray for breakthrough while staying connected to what keeps breaking you internally. You cannot carry peace while entertaining chaos disguised as concern. There is a strategy that goes beyond simple disagreement or personality conflict, and it shows up when emotional manipulation becomes a spiritual tactic meant to drain your strength and silence your authority. Recognizing emotional manipulation as a spiritual strategy requires more than intelligence, requires spiritual clarity. This kind of manipulation doesn't always come loudly. It can appear in conversations where someone twists your words until you begin questioning your own intentions. It shows up when they make you feel responsible for their emotions, their reactions, and even their spiritual condition. They position themselves as the victim, forcing you into the role of the rescuer even when they are the ones causing harm. And because your heart is compassionate, you step into that role without realizing you are being spiritually trapped. Emotional manipulation works like a slow leak in your spirit. One moment doesn't break you, but consistent exposure leaves you empty. You begin to notice that certain people only reach out when they need something. They do not call to pour into you, to pray with you, or to strengthen your walk. They call when they are in crisis, and once they feel better, they disappear again. This cycle is not just emotional, it's spiritual dependency designed to keep you from growing. They pull on your empathy until you start feeling guilty for even wanting peace. They speak in circles that create confusion, and confusion is never from God. Confusion is a sign that something spiritual is at play. They shift blame, avoid accountability, and make you feel like correcting them is an act of cruelty. Their emotions become a prison, and they use guilt as the lock on the door. Manipulation often wears the mask of love. It looks like concern, but it shows up only when control is threatened. They will say they care about you, but their reactions reveal they care more about maintaining influence over you. They want access to your life without responsibility for your well-being. They celebrate your growth as long as your growth doesn't lead to independence. The moment you begin to think for yourself, pray for yourself, and seek God without their interpretation, they feel threatened. And instead of celebrating your spiritual maturity, they try to pull you back using emotional ties. They remind you of times they were there for you to keep you indebted. They say things like, I was the only one who stood by you, not to express loyalty, but to secure control. You start shrinking your voice around them to avoid conflict. You adjust your truth to protect their feelings. You carry the weight of their reactions like it's your spiritual duty. That is how manipulation entangles you. It convinces you that your peace is less important than their comfort. It convinces you that your calling should bend around their emotions. But every time you minimize your voice to maintain fake peace, you step out of alignment with your purpose. Your spirit begins to feel heavy because you are operating under pressure instead of freedom. You begin to sense that something is off, but manipulation clouds your discernment with guilt. You tell yourself, maybe I'm being too harsh, or maybe I should be more understanding. But those thoughts don't come with peace, they come with anxiety. A clear sign of emotional manipulation is that the relationship drains you more than it builds you. After speaking with them, you don't feel encouraged. You feel spiritually tired. They don't offer solutions. They only offer problems and expect you to respond as if it's your mission to fix everything. They speak in emotional language, but their emotions are tools designed to shift responsibility away from them and onto you. And while you are busy trying to rescue them, your own spiritual focus begins to fade. Your prayer life becomes inconsistent because your energy is tied to their drama. Your worship feels heavy because your spirit is entangled with their chaos. That's how manipulation becomes a spiritual attack. It steals your focus from God and redirects it to emotional fires that were never yours to put out. Once you start noticing these patterns, something shifts inside you. Your spirit begins to resist the familiar pull of emotional obligation. You start realizing that love does not mean surrendering your peace to maintain someone else's comfort. Love can be honest. Love can say no. Love can create distance without bitterness. And when manipulation no longer works, the spirit behind it becomes exposed. Suddenly, their tone changes. They accuse you of being distant, ungrateful, or prideful. They try to stir emotional reactions in you to regain control. But manipulation loses its power the moment you stop responding with guilt and start responding with discernment. Protecting your peace without feeling guilty for setting boundaries is one of the most powerful spiritual disciplines you can develop. So often, people confuse love and sacrifice with allowing their peace to be stolen or compromised. Boundaries are not rejection, they are protection. They are a declaration that your spirit matters, that your time matters, and that your emotional and spiritual health is not negotiable. When you fail to protect your peace, you open the door for repeated attacks, for negative cycles, for manipulation, and for spiritual exhaustion. People may argue that boundaries are selfish, that loving others requires you to tolerate chaos, but God never calls you to give your life away at the expense of your spirit. True love does not destroy your inner sanctuary. It preserves it while allowing others to confront their issues responsibly. Many times, the hardest boundaries are the ones we place with people we love. Family, close friends, mentors. These are often the same individuals who intentionally or not threaten our peace. They may not understand your call, your journey, or your sensitivity to the spiritual realm. They may operate in old patterns, in ways that once benefited you but now only drain you. Setting boundaries with them can feel like betrayal, but it's actually a form of spiritual obedience. You are declaring to God and yourself that your peace is sacred. You are saying that you will not allow constant chaos to define your experience, that you will not allow criticism, manipulation, or negativity to penetrate the temple of your spirit. This does not make you cold, it makes you wise. Wisdom always requires discernment between what must be endured and what must be refused. When you establish these boundaries, the reactions of others can test you. They might accuse you of being distant or prideful. They may use guilt, appeal to past memories, or even attempt to manipulate you into abandoning your convictions. These reactions are predictable and they are part of the spiritual test. If protecting your peace is easy, it's probably not significant enough to matter. The spiritual challenge is not in placing the boundary, it's in standing firm when others try to tear it down. That is where maturity in the spirit is tested. A strong spirit recognizes that it is not called to approval, but to alignment with God's will. Approval can fluctuate, but alignment produces lasting peace and fruit. By maintaining healthy boundaries, you prevent yourself from becoming entangled in battles that do not belong to you and that steal energy meant for your calling. It is crucial to remember that boundaries are not walls meant to isolate, they are gates meant to control access. Just as a city gate allows the right people in while keeping enemies out, your boundaries determine who and what enters your inner life. Every person who violates your peace can be an opportunity to test the strength of your discernment. Every relationship that triggers consistent unrest is a signal to reevaluate the spiritual atmosphere around you. Your peace is not negotiable, and no one has the authority to dictate your emotional or spiritual state except the Lord. Establishing boundaries is an act of faith. It shows that you trust God to handle the consequences while you commit to your well-being. It shows that you understand your authority as a believer and the responsibility to steward your spirit carefully. People often struggle with boundaries because they feel guilty for prioritizing themselves. They think, I am supposed to be selfless, loving, and accommodating. But love without wisdom is vulnerability, and love without discernment is spiritual recklessness. Protecting your peace does not negate your love for others. It ensures that your love is sustainable. It ensures that your ability to give, to encourage, and to support others remains strong. Without boundaries, you risk exhaustion, resentment, and spiritual compromise. Boundaries are not a punishment for others. They are a safeguard for your spirit and a platform for authentic relationships where both parties can thrive. A healthy boundary requires clarity, consistency, And courage, clarity allows you to define what is acceptable and what is not. Consistency ensures that the boundary is respected regardless of circumstances or pressures. Courage gives you the strength to stand firm even when others resist. Implementing boundaries can feel uncomfortable at first because it challenges old patterns, confronts expectations, and disrupts familiar dynamics. But discomfort is often the precursor to growth. Spiritual warfare will attempt to exploit your hesitation, guilt, or fear. But the moment you claim your peace with authority, you strengthen your spirit. Boundaries become shields, protecting your soul from unnecessary attacks, preserving your focus, and creating space for God to move freely in your life. Protecting your peace without guilt requires constant self-awareness. It requires asking, am I compromising my spirit for approval? Or am I sacrificing my calling for someone else's comfort? Reflection like this keeps you aligned with God's purposes. It keeps your spirit sensitive to manipulation, emotional exhaustion, and spiritual attacks that seek to undermine your stability. Every time you enforce a boundary, you are making a spiritual statement that your peace matters, that your time matters, that your calling matters, and that God's authority over your life is supreme. The enemy resists this awareness, but steadfast protection of your inner life creates spiritual momentum that cannot be stopped. Understanding that love does not mean tolerating spiritual attacks is one of the hardest lessons to learn, especially when those attacks come from people you care about. Love is often confused with endurance, tolerance, and sacrifice to the point of self-destruction, but God never intended for your heart to be a doormat for the enemy's strategies. Love is not passive, love is active, and it carries wisdom and discernment. When someone repeatedly attacks your spirit, verbally, emotionally, or through patterns of behavior, responding with silence or forced patience does not equal love, it equals compromise. To truly love, you must first protect the temple of your spirit, because the condition of your inner life determines your capacity to love others effectively. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot minister from a wounded place if you refuse to recognize the source of the wound. Spiritual attacks often masquerade as mistakes, misunderstandings, or personal differences. You might be tempted to overlook them because you want to preserve relationships or avoid conflict. But failing to address the spiritual reality allows the enemy to gain ground. Repeated offenses create cycles of resentment and confusion that weaken your spirit and cloud your judgment. Love that tolerates attack without discernment becomes a doorway for ongoing manipulation, control, and spiritual oppression. God calls you to love with a shield, to engage with wisdom, and to separate behavior from personhood when necessary. Recognizing the difference between the one you love and the spirit influencing their actions is key to responding correctly without compromising your peace or calling. When you understand that love does not mean tolerating spiritual attacks, you begin to see relationships in a new light. You notice behaviors that previously seemed harmless, but actually carry weight against your spirit. Criticism repeated with hidden malice, subtle jealousy, words meant to diminish your faith or calling, and attempts to create division are all forms of spiritual attack. They may come from family, friends, or mentors, and they may be disguised as concern, advice, or even humor. Love without discernment will excuse the behavior, rationalize the motives, and allow it to continue, leaving your soul exposed. But discernment allows you to maintain love for the person while protecting yourself from the attack, holding space for prayer and spiritual intervention without becoming complicit in the negative cycle. The key is to remember that boundaries and confrontation are expressions of love, not hatred. Protecting your spirit while addressing attacks demonstrates that you value the health of the relationship and the spiritual well-being of everyone involved. When you respond with wisdom, prayer, and strategic action, you are not rejecting the person. You are rejecting the influence that seeks to harm you. This approach allows you to engage with intention rather than reaction, to act from a place of power rather than fear, and to maintain integrity in your interactions. Love does not blindly endure. It actively seeks restoration, balance, and peace while refusing to participate in chaos or compromise. Another important aspect of this principle is recognizing the difference between temporary tension and consistent attack. Every relationship experiences moments of disagreement, but when patterns emerge that consistently drain your spirit, disrupt your peace, or lead to manipulation, that is a signal that spiritual warfare may be at play. Identifying these patterns requires careful observation, prayer, and sometimes guidance from spiritually mature mentors. Love that tolerates repeated attacks under the guise of forgiveness or patience is ineffective because it confuses mercy with neglect. True love understands timing, consequence, and the need for protective measures while still remaining compassionate and willing to seek reconciliation when appropriate. When you apply this understanding in your life, your perspective on relationships shifts dramatically. You stop excusing harmful behaviors in the name of love. You stop justifying patterns of spiritual attack. You begin to recognize that protecting your spirit is not selfish but necessary, that establishing boundaries is not unloving but wise, and that discernment is a form of spiritual responsibility. By doing so, you not only safeguard your own soul, but you also model healthy spiritual practices for others. Your ability to respond in love without tolerating attack becomes a testimony of strength, faith, and obedience. It demonstrates that you are committed to walking in God's truth, prioritizing the integrity of your spirit, and refusing to participate in cycles that allow the enemy access to your life. Spiritual maturity includes the ability to love without compromise, to respond to attacks with wisdom, and to maintain a posture of faith while asserting the authority God has given you. It requires ongoing prayer, self-reflection, and courage to enforce boundaries when necessary. Every time you choose love with discernment, you are reinforcing the power of your spirit, protecting your calling, and walking in alignment with God's will. You come to understand that love is not permission for abuse, nor is it an excuse to ignore spiritual realities. Instead, love becomes a proactive, fortified force that honors God, preserves your peace, and allows you to engage with others without falling prey to spiritual attack. Discerning the difference between a wounded person and a willing vessel for darkness is one of the most delicate yet essential aspects of spiritual awareness. Not everyone who hurts, struggles, or acts out is carrying demonic influence. Many people are simply dealing with pain, trauma, or emotional wounds that have shaped their behavior in unhealthy ways. These individuals need compassion, understanding, and sometimes guidance to navigate their challenges. However, the danger arises when a person not only carries hurt, but also becomes a conduit for spiritual attacks against others, consciously or unconsciously allowing negative forces to manipulate their behavior. The ability to distinguish between these two realities is critical for protecting your spirit, maintaining healthy relationships, and responding with both wisdom and love. A wounded person operates from a place of vulnerability. They may lash out, speak harshly, or display patterns of insecurity, but their intent is not necessarily malicious. Their actions are usually reactive, stemming from past experiences rather than spiritual strategy. They might repeat patterns of negativity because they haven't learned healthier ways to cope, but they are still capable of change and redemption. Recognizing this allows you to approach them with grace, prayer, and understanding. You can set boundaries without condemning them, offer support without sacrificing your peace, and pray for breakthrough without taking responsibility for the cycles that they are caught in. Their battle is internal, and while it may affect you, it is not a deliberate attempt to disrupt your spiritual walk. A willing vessel for darkness, on the other hand, functions very differently. This person may appear charming, familiar, or even caring on the surface, but their actions consistently undermine, manipulate, or attack those around them. They may consciously or subconsciously carry influences that oppose God's work in your life. Unlike someone who is merely wounded, a willing vessel aligns their behavior with patterns of spiritual attack, either knowingly or through repeated submission to negative influences. Their presence consistently disrupts peace, creates division, and diminishes spiritual strength. Discernment is required to recognize when patterns are not simply human mistakes or emotional reactions, but signs of a spirit operating through a person. Without discernment, it is easy to misread the situation, either excusing harmful behavior that should be confronted or responding with hostility towards someone who only needs compassion. The difference between these two types of individuals often comes down to patterns over time. Wounded people may have moments of chaos, but they also show the capacity for change, growth, and restoration. They seek reconciliation, respond positively to correction, and demonstrate a desire to heal. A willing vessel for darkness, however, rarely changes. They repeat harmful behaviors despite consequences and opportunities for intervention. They resist correction, deflect responsibility, and seem to operate in a spiritual rhythm that continually produces harm. Their influence leaves a lingering sense of heaviness, confusion, and spiritual depletion in those around them. Discernment involves paying attention not only to words and actions, but also to the spiritual atmosphere they carry. When interactions consistently drain your faith, peace, or joy, that is a sign that the influence may be spiritual rather than simply emotional. Prayer and spiritual sensitivity are essential tools in making this distinction. You must approach each situation with humility, seeking God's guidance to understand the heart behind the behavior. Ask for wisdom to see the difference between temporary pain and spiritual compromise. Be honest with yourself about the impact the person has on your life and listen to the convictions of your spirit. God gives discernment as a gift to help you navigate these complex dynamics, allowing you to respond appropriately. Whether that means offering support, creating distance, or taking spiritual measures to protect your life, this is not about judgment or condemnation. It is about responsibility and obedience to the way God has called you to live in spiritual alignment. Setting boundaries becomes an act of both protection and love. For a wounded person, boundaries help them experience accountability without feeling rejected or abandoned. For a willing vessel for darkness, boundaries prevent further manipulation and spiritual harm while keeping your faith and calling intact. Recognizing the difference ensures that your response is measured, strategic, and aligned with God's will. You do not need to sever every relationship entirely, but you must establish spiritual safeguards that protect your inner life from repeated exposure to destructive forces. Awareness and discernment empower you to engage without becoming entangled, to love without compromising, and to minister without being misused. Over time, discernment strengthens your ability to respond appropriately in every relationship. You learn to identify the subtle signs of spiritual influence, to recognize the patterns of behavior that indicate underlying motives, and to act in ways that preserve your peace while honoring God. By understanding the difference between someone who is wounded and someone who is a vessel for darkness, you are able to navigate difficult interactions with clarity, confidence, and compassion. Your spirit becomes fortified, your prayer life deepens, and your capacity to walk in obedience and authority increases. This knowledge equips you to protect yourself, protect your family, and protect your calling from those who may unintentionally or intentionally carry influences that oppose goddesses in your life. Strengthening your spirit so you don't become what you're fighting against is one of the most essential principles in spiritual warfare. Many people enter battles with faith, hope, and a desire to see God's kingdom advance, only to find that repeated exposure to conflict, manipulation, and spiritual attack slowly erodes their peace, patience, and discernment. The enemy understands that the most effective way to derail your purpose is not just to attack you externally, but to infiltrate your heart, your mind, and your spirit so that over time you begin to mirror the very darkness you are resisting. Strengthening your spirit is not an option, it is a necessity. It is the armor that allows you to stand firm, the foundation that keeps you grounded, and the compass that ensures your response remains aligned with God's truth rather than with reaction or retaliation. Strengthening your spirit begins with awareness. You must be honest about the battles you are facing, both seen and unseen. Many believers underestimate the subtle influence of spiritual warfare, thinking that prayer alone or occasional reflection is enough. But the reality is that constant vigilance, spiritual discipline, and consistent engagement with God's word are required to maintain stability in the midst of conflict. When your spirit is underdeveloped or neglected, you become vulnerable to anger, resentment, pride, or fear, qualities that the enemy can exploit to pull you into his territory. Strengthening your spirit means committing to regular spiritual practices that cultivate resilience, clarity, and inner peace. It means allowing prayer, meditation, fasting, worship, and study to shape your responses and fortify your inner life. Another critical component is discernment. The more you strengthen your spirit, The more attuned you become to the subtle influences around you, you begin to recognize patterns of behavior that are not aligned with God's truth. The moments when conversations are designed to destabilize your faith, and the situations where the enemy seeks to provoke reactions that compromise your spiritual integrity. Discernment allows you to engage with situations and people without absorbing the negativity or participating in cycles that would erode your character. You can identify the difference between a genuine challenge and a trap, between a call for correction and a setup for deception. By owning your spiritual sensitivity, you protect yourself from becoming reactive, defensive, or emotionally entangled in ways that mirror the attack against you. Strengthening your spirit also involves building resilience through faith. This means developing an unwavering trust in God's power, His promises, and His protection, even when circumstances appear threatening or confusing. Resilience prevents you from being swayed by fear, intimidation, or manipulation. It allows you to maintain clarity of thought and purpose under pressure, and it equips you to respond with wisdom rather than impulsivity. When your faith is strong, you do not need to prove yourself in the eyes of others or justify your boundaries. You operate from a position of authority, knowing that God's guidance and protection are sufficient to sustain you through every encounter, every challenge, and every spiritual test. Equally important is emotional intelligence. Strengthening your spirit requires mastering your emotions so that they serve you rather than control you. The enemy seeks to exploit unresolved anger, hurt, bitterness, or jealousy to lure you into retaliation or compromise. By understanding and managing your emotional responses, you maintain the ability to act intentionally rather than react destructively. Emotional awareness also allows you to empathize with others without being drawn into their chaos. You can love without being drained, support without being manipulated, and engage without absorbing the attack. Emotional strength complements spiritual resilience, creating a fortified inner life that is difficult to shake. Accountability and community play a vital role in strengthening your spirit. Walking alone in the midst of spiritual warfare leaves you exposed to blind spots and unrecognized vulnerabilities. Surrounding yourself with mentors, trusted friends, and spiritually mature individuals provides guidance, perspective, and reinforcement. Accountability helps you recognize patterns of compromise or weakness before they become dangerous. Community offers encouragement and prayer support, which sustains your spiritual energy and helps you remain aligned with God's calling. No one is designed to fight every battle alone, and strength is often multiplied through shared wisdom and support. Finally, strengthening your spirit is about continuous alignment with God's purpose. The enemy targets your calling because he knows that when you are fulfilling your divine assignment, you operate with influence and authority. By staying connected to God, immersing yourself in His Word, and cultivating a life of prayer and obedience, you ensure that your identity remains rooted in Him rather than in the circumstances, conflicts, or attacks you face. When your spirit is strong, you resist the temptation to mirror negativity, to retaliate in anger, or to compromise integrity for temporary relief. Instead, you respond with discernment, grace, and power, preserving not only your peace, but also the witness of your life as a vessel aligned with God's kingdom.